So the Arctic is warming a lot. The planet's northern polar region recorded its second hottest 12-month period to September 20th. This has led to declining ice, rising waters, even the opening of a new sea, and fires in northern Siberia. And basically, what's also happening here is that from the Bering Strait to Greenland to the Faroe Islands, everyone from Russia to China to the United States to NATO wants control of this final frontier. So today, Drew and I are going to talk about this issue that to me is really fascinating and doesn't get covered much, but it's kind of this race to the frontier, which is the Arctic. What's going to happen? War, peace, a better world economy? Today, we'll talk about it. So what's up, Drew? This is an interesting topic to me. What are your thoughts and just everything on this?
Well, I'll be honest. Like, I mean, I had already known about the Arctic, receding and everything, and the environmental and challenges that had, and implications. Right, I knew about that because I'm just interested in the environment. I'm concerned about it. But when you had mentioned to me that you would want to do this topic about more the, foreign relations and just the political implications of the Arctic, I was kind of like, huh? And then looking more into it. It really is becoming a strategic, battleground in the light, with quotes on it, because there's no conflict really yet. But like the tensions are rising, and what was once this, something that was super important in the Cold War era because of how close Russia and Alaska, the United States are to each other, and how large Russia is and how it encompasses a lot of the Arctic, I understood why it was important then, but I was like, it's becoming important again today. But it really is. It's really fascinating, and it makes sense based on what we're seeing with what you said is it's literally melting into a new frontier. The window of trade that goes through the melted Arctic passages, right? Usually they'd melt and then they'd freeze up again. That window is getting longer and longer, increased trade activity. And then, as we will dive into more, I'm sure, is changing foreign relations dynamics. China and Russia are more buddy-buddy than before, and it's causing interesting issues. But all that to say was just, I think for a lot of people, and you hear the headline of like the Arctic becoming a strategic battleground, and you're like, huh, what? And it really is.
Definitely. And it's like you have this map up here on the screen, and before we were recording, I think both of us were talking about how the Arctic is so much bigger and misrepresented on most maps, right? I mean, if we just look at this map, it goes let's remember the world's round, right? And so it literally just covers this whole northern part of the entire globe. And so theoretically speaking, you could go from China to Russia. I mean, or actually, no, that's really easy. You could go from like China to, I don't know, Greenland. And I always think back, there's this show called The Terror on AMC that I loved. And it's actually a true story based on Sir John Franklin and these 128 men that were part of the British Navy. And they were some of the first ones to explore this Northwest Passage that links the North Atlantic to the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And it actually was quite grotesque because these guys all froze to death. There was cannibalism. It was kind of like the Donner Party in the Arctic type of scenario.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's a great show. They had some kind of horror supernatural twists in the show, but it's really good period piece. But it just reminds me that people have been trying to do this for a long time, but like Drew talked about, with the change in the climate and these thawing seas, like it's going to be interesting. And like on the geopolitical side, like, back in the day, especially during kind of the golden era of Spain, when they got over to the New World, you basically put your country's flag on the ground and it was yours. Right. And I'm curious how this is going to work because we have laws, we have a geopolitical order, and Politico had a really good piece, and I just want to skim through this because I think it sets kind of a good backdrop of what could happen, and then maybe we should actually specify the regions because there's different things happening here. But basically Politico talks about there's 5 races that are happening in the Arctic. The first one is the race for better trade routes, and this is kind of China and Asia mainly. Because basically the world economy could boom if China could find a quicker way to basically access Europe and the Northern Passage, right? Because right now that's just not happening. But if China had better access to Scandinavia, Europe, that could really change global dynamics. And so for China, that's kind of the big route, and the US is probably definitely going to be butting heads with them. The second one they talk about is the race for supremacy. And this is kind of between Russia and the United States, right? Because both have had bases, I mean, yeah, like you said, like we forget that a lot of these bases have kind of been shut down now, but there's activity growing again, especially on Russia's side.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a race for old Cold War issues, And yeah, I think that's interesting. And then there's third, the race for resources. And this is where I could see probably the biggest form of maybe overlapping interests and overlapping conflict that could grow out of it. I mean, like, yeah, this is a number I have here, is that 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of its undiscovered gas, and an abundance of uranium, rare earth minerals, gold, and diamonds, fisheries galore, according to Mike Pompeo, is what is in the Arctic. So the United States is looking at this. Obviously, China's looking at it. Europe's looking at it. And, we could see some insane growth in just resources. But the problem is, to get them, ice melting is going to have to continue. And that brings up another plethora of issues. There's also, to me, the fear of thawing ice could also lead to potential bacteria, viruses that have been just dormant for thousands of years, potentially.
Jeez.
They've picked up strains of dead viruses amongst reindeer in Greenland. So there's a scary side to this. And real quick, number 4, tourism, which could be good and bad, because tourism could bring giant cruise ships, more fossil fuels, and depletion of, local villages. And the 5th one is what you also talked about, the environmental push, which I think would come out of tourism. But there is going to be a battle of trying to limit activity in that region, and it's going to come to clash with this resource heavy area as well. So I think those are the big races that could be happening there. And unfortunately, those different interests do not go together well sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, every large nation wants to have dominant control over any kind of like new resource or valuable area of resources, right? And what does that actually mean? So, for example, we put sanctions on Russia after Russia invaded Crimea. Right? It's kind of a punishment because we don't agree with them just invading Crimea and taking it for their own. So, a lot of the world has sanctions against Russia. China does not have any sanctions against Russia and is not a part of that. And so they're actually, filling the void for some of the that was left by these sanctions. So there's pipelines and facilities on the Yamal Peninsula that go to China and Russia. So a lot of Sino-Russian relations are improving in this area. And I could also see how Russia and China would also like to fill, that void of sanctions and external influence in any way possible by using the resources in the Arctic. So is the United States. I mean, as far as the environmental issue, I mean, there's been a lot of big legal battles of whether or not, some people can drill in parts of Alaska. The Trump administration has been trying to get rid of, some environmental protections for drilling in some parts of the Arctic, in some wilderness refuges, because there is, like you said, 30% of the undiscovered oil or whatever is in this, in the Arctic zone. Alaska is a hotbed for oil and other resources. So we see the evidence of these large nations trying to utilize this region. And also the dynamics of like military emplacements is changing. You had mentioned it a little bit, but Russia is like reopening old Soviet era bases and kind of upfitting them and uplifting them to be more modern. In the last, from what I've read from multiple sources over the last decade, as a whole, Russia has been modernizing its military. We are not in the Soviet era of, T-34 tanks and an AK-47. I mean, we are. It's a modern world, baby. We got lasers, we got missiles, we got IBMs, right? They got everything, and they're getting close to that, right? Same thing with China. I think China's military 20, 30 years ago was in the same boat where it was T-34 tanks and the AK-47, right? Kind of Tiananmen Square era. China's now updated with everything as well. I mean, they have, data systems and laser guided missiles, right? It's a different world than the Cold War, but now we're seeing that the strategic areas open up again in a kind of a different climate. I'm interested to see what the massive troops will be without like in a modern world. I mean, I think Pompeo talked about the importance of the Aleutian Islands, which is that string of islands coming off of Alaska, and how they need to keep up like their Air Force and Space Force presence there, because they can get so much recon and insight into that area through air superiority. And I agree with that. I think that's fine. I think we should. I'm really am worried about China and Russia's military rise, and I do think that we need to kind of combat it. What I'm worried about, though, is that idea that since the Arctic is melting, and that it's just going to become a free-for-all of resources, and it's almost ironic because it's opening up because of the environmental destruction, and then it's going to lead to more environmental destruction because it's opening up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice fitting end to that situation. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's a good point that you highlighted too, is that I feel like a lot of, especially under Trump, the United States is very focused on the eastern side of the Arctic. Obviously this is relative to a flat map, but the eastern side meaning like Greenland, the Faroe Islands, kind of the northern United Kingdom, eastern Canada. I
Yeah.
feel like that's where a lot of the world's focused because of the resources. But again, like you're showing here on the map, I think it's a great point is that the Bering Strait is actually the really strategic part. The Business Insider article I was just looking at that was kind of talking about the escalations that Russia is working on. It basically says the Bering Strait has long been an area of low tension and cooperation on matters, but that's quickly changing, because it is the only way to connect the Northwest Passage and the Northern Passage. And so what I'm kind of concerned about, though, is that it looks like Russia is amping up their bases and they're actually more prepared for this region. And that's kind of what you were saying as well, is while the U.S. actually, like most of these bases that we have are currently either closed or on like a skeleton crew. And there's this one base, I don't know if it's pronounced correct, I've only seen it in writing, but it's Adak, which is in the Aleutian Island chain. And it was closed in the 90s. And now the Navy's like, well, damn, do we need to reopen this, And so there is a discussion in the US that's like, oh my God, like Russia's already here and doing stuff. And we are just like waking up to this. And I think that's one of the negatives kind of the Trump administration, is that we just haven't been hard on Russia, but we've been so focused on trade wars with China and, obviously other issues with our allies that we've kind of forgot that this is a serious region and there's stuff happening there. And in the US, like up in that area, we don't actually have a lot of great infrastructure right now. We don't have any deep sea ports while Russia does. And so I'm just kind of curious to see how this ends up happening, And there's this guy who's Admiral Michael Gilday. He's the Navy's top officer in the United States, and he says that the Bering Strait could actually be as strategically important as the Strait of Hormuz. So it's going to be interesting, man.
I did want to talk a little bit about that eastern area. What is it called? The Guick Pass, or the Greenland, Iceland, UK area?
Yes, that
that little story about the Faroe Islands that we read about was super interesting, because again, I mean, Faroe Islands is something that I've only heard of like 4 times ever, and how talking about how this little tiny, like technically a member of what, Denmark, right?
Yep.
But they're kind of, at least with trade law, they're independent, and how this little island is getting back onto the world stage is because, again, this corridor is so strategically important that, for the Cold War, the Faroe Islands was kind of the hot kid in the seat because of the strategic importance of the location, and it died down for a couple of decades, and now it's back. I mean, they even talked about it. I think one of the ministers of the Faroe Islands said that their best resource is their location, and that's true. So they have a trade deal with Russia over fish that's independent from the EU, which is pretty crazy. And now they're engaging in talks. They talked with Mike Pompeo when he met the King of Denmark. He invited over the Minister of the Faroe Islands, which is usually not the case. And so, you have, they're dealing with the big dogs, these little tiny blip of islands north of, like, super far north of the UK. I mean, normally you'd be like, who cares? But it's such an important corridor of trade and strategic access of the Arctic into the North Atlantic that, big players are trying to gain influence in the Faroe Islands. Mike Pompeo even asked the minister of the Faroe Islands, hey, why don't you have an embassy with us? Because they have an embassy in Moscow and Beijing. Again, another tell of that they're playing with big dogs. The Faroe Islands, not even kind of completely autonomous nation, a semi-autonomous, has its own embassies in Moscow and Beijing. I mean, damn.
Yeah, and actually, I think that highlights one of my bigger fears, geopolitical, in terms of potential conflict, is that the Faroe Islands seems to be playing both sides.
Yeah.
Like, because they're technically, part of Denmark, but clearly they operate on different laws and regulations. And the problem is, that same foreign policy article talked about how they did decline a deal with Huawei in China for a 5G network there, talking about how they preferred to work with Europe or the United States. But then at the same time, clearly they're working with Russia, right? That maritime trade deal, embassies in Russia. So it's almost like, okay, so on the Western side, that's that Bering Strait side, you have Russia and China with similar interests. But then you have the Faroe Islands, who's actually saying no to China and yes to Russia. So you have an alliance that's being broken by the Faroe Islands. Plus you have Europe, NATO, the United States all trying to get in there. To me, that just spells something in terms of a problem, because I think the elephant in the room is that the Faroe Islands are going to need to have some more uniformity in dealing with these countries, and they don't. And eventually someone's going to get pissed,
Yeah, or Europe's going to get pissed because they're like,
True.
You're technically still European, sort of, kind of. I also, that was really telling to me as well. That was something I picked up on when I was reading the article, was how the Faroe Islands, even though culturally and geographically you could place them in the West, they were very willing to deal with the Chinese. And again, they only rejected that Huawei deal because it got leaked that China was going to say, was basically irking them, like, hey, it'll be a lot easier to get a free trade deal with us if you let Huawei in. And someone recorded that when they weren't supposed to. That got leaked out, and that's what put the public pressure of politicians. I think even the minister was like, hey, because this was a private Faroe Islands telecommunications company dealing with Huawei, not the government. So the government even said, we'd prefer you to go with an American or a European firm. They were gonna go with China. They were gonna go with Huawei, and it only got leaked that there was political motive of the free trade deal, ruined the whole thing. But it told me. It told me that, one, it confirmed of all of our things we've been saying about China, which is, you can't trust these private Chinese companies to not have an ulterior political motive, right? To say that, oh, Huawei just wants to sell phones and not somehow bring people into the fold of the Belt and Road. Are you kidding me? Of course it's all part of the plan. And they're even willing to do it in basically what we consider the West, Faroe Islands. So that was really telling, is hey, man, they got caught. They got caught. Who's willing to work with China if they don't get caught?
I feel like that'd be very fitting too if the Faroe Islands were the start of some sort of global Cold War or conflict, right? It'd just be very fitting. Just this kind of tiny, not even country.
Nowheresville, yeah.
Yeah, and no, I mean, I think that's a good point. And boy, that would just even shake Europe and NATO and just that whole region even more. Imagine if you had the Faroe Islands kind of playing leeway between China, Russia, NATO, and the United States. I mean, I guess it's good that they were caught doing this with China, though it doesn't really matter. But I also wanted to kind of mention what my other fear is climate, not just because everything's melting up there, which is obviously clearly a problem. But it's the fact that it almost seems like the escalation in terms of looking for resources almost means the world would probably not be trying to get off of oil. The fact that there's so much oil up there and clearly every nation wants to get it is just kind of pessimistic and dark to me, because it shows that maybe no one really wants to get away from oil if we're looking ahead to get up there to start finding more of it. And so then I feel like it could just, exasperate our problems if you have tour ships going up there, you have drilling, you have potential new diseases. I feel like it could just make the health of the world in general worse. And I don't know, but I did want to also mention that there is policy wise, there is actually an international organization a treaty signed by multiple countries that actually is dealing with this right now, and it's actually called the Arctic Council. And right now, the United States and Russia and China are all part of this. And one optimistic thing that I got out of just reading about the Arctic Council was that actually a lot of the time, Russia and the United States actually work together on a lot of issues in this region. They actually have better communication than one would imagine. And they're kind of dealing with the 7 Cs, which are climate, commodities, commerce, connectivity, communities, cooperation, and competition. And so the kind of rosy part of this is that, especially with a Biden administration, where there is a lot of expertise and there is this willingness to work together, what we need is a policy-driven approach to how to handle this. I don't know if that means divvying up the region. I don't know if that means I don't know. I don't know. This is all just speculative, but I feel like there is steps, like countries are aware of this, and clearly the national policy of many countries is involving this. So that is a plus. And just to name a few, and this is off the Arctic Council's website, they actually have, let's see, 4 major treaties already signed. One is the Agreement on Enhancing International Arctic Scientific Cooperation, which was signed in May. And so obviously that's great for dealing with not only what is found there, but probably climate action as well. Then there's the Agreement on Cooperation on Aeronautical and Maritime Research and Rescue in the Arctic, which I guess is good if you have some serious issues up there. You have the Agreement on Cooperation on Marine Oil Pollution Preparedness, which I like. Sorry. And an Agreement on Enhancing International Arctic Scientific Cooperation. So I like that. At least there's dialogue happening, right? So no one's just going in there just out of the blue with potential conflict.
Yeah, and I hope it continues, right? That's the issue, is because, it like we said, it's been pretty quiet for a while, and there was a lot of cooperation. It's only now that it's worth something again, that it's changing, and so the struggle will be to maintain those relationships, right? Those relationships are there, and the communication was there. It's how do we maintain that so we don't avoid going back to some kind of free for all, first to the resource or no communication, Cold War style. So I have hope that Biden his administration is more willing to be communicative and cooperative, but who knows? I really don't know. And I think in that article that talked about those 7 Cs, they had mentioned that Biden's comprehensive foreign policy plan kind of didn't really talk about the Arctic much. So we'll have to kind of see when he gets in office, what that really means on the ground, like everything else, I guess, with his administration. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly interesting to see this region get so in the limelight again. And I do hope it can be a bastion of cooperation. I mean, look at Antarctica, right? That's one in the south. Antarctica. I mean, that was basically the world agreed with each other that we should not conquer that, and it should be used for scientific purposes only. And that's what it's been doing. I mean, people just study penguins down there. There's nothing going on. Obviously, Arctics might be a little bit different when they find a ton of oil, so we'll have to see how it plays out. But to wrap this up, if you are wondering why Donald Trump a few years ago tweeted why he wanted to buy Greenland, this is it.
Yeah, man. And I mean, just, we've been talking for a couple weeks now about how Trump's kind of being sporadic and crazy with international stuff right now. Hey, let's just seize Greenland and the Faroe Islands.
Let's just buy them.
Kidding.
Let's just buy them.
Or buy them. Yeah. Like, let's do it. No, but yeah, great points there. I agree with you. I'm excited that we talked about this today. It's definitely going to be something to keep watching.
Yeah.
And hopefully in a good way. Hopefully we see, like you said, an Antarctica come out of this. But again, like you also said, they didn't find gold or oil in Antarctica, so
yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, maybe they'll find Hitler's secret bunker or whatever that weird conspiracy theory is.
It's there, man. I've seen it in my dreams.
It's in the sub-Antarctic, man. All right, guys. Well, thank you for tuning into the Tonic Accord podcast. Hopefully, we could shed light on a topic that maybe hadn't hit your radar yet. Anything else you wanted to say before we get out of here?
Let's start a petition, buy Greenland or invade Greenland. Yeah. I'm kidding again. But
all right, everyone, hashtag invade Greenland. Get that trending.
Oh boy. Anyways, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, Twitch, and yeah, let us know what you think. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys later.
Take care.